There are people in every era whose job it is to look at the world with a precision that most people do not possess and do not seek. People who measure and record, who go where others have not gone and bring back the shape of what they found, who produce, from the patient accumulation of observation, a kind of truth that has the particular quality of being usable, of being something you can hold in your hands and navigate by. Cartographers. In Aeloria's later centuries, the tradition of cartography was well established. The city's geographical position, on a significant coastal route at the intersection of several overland trading paths, meant that accurate maps were of genuine commercial and practical value. There were perhaps a dozen working cartographers in Aeloria at any given time, each with their own specialty and their own style, each contributing to the city's extensive archive of maps that covered not just the Silver Coast and its region, but in some cases much wider territories described by returning travelers and traders. The most remarkable of these cartographers was a woman named Senel. We know more about Senel than about most Aelorians, because she left more than most Aelorians did. Not just her maps, though the maps alone would make her significant. She left letters. She left what appear to be working notes, fragments of the kind of thinking-out-loud writing that most people of her era would have consigned to fire rather than archive. She left, inadvertently, the traces of a mind in the process of discovering something it wasn't sure how to understand. Senel came to cartography through an unusual route. She had been trained first as a structural engineer, one of the people who worked on maintaining the city's buildings and infrastructure. This background gave her a particular quality of attention when she later moved to map-making. She was interested not just in the surfaces of things, but in their underlying structure. Not just where things were, but what was holding them up. Not just the city as it appeared from above, but the city as it was, all the way down. Her early maps were conventional, if unusually precise. She mapped the harbor and the surrounding coast with a detail that improved on every previous chart of the area. She mapped the inland routes to the north and east, traveling them herself. She was, by the accounts of people who knew her, a person who was essentially uncomfortable with information she hadn't gathered firsthand. She mapped the terraced farms on the hillside above the city with an attention to the drainage patterns and soil variation that made her work as useful to the farmers as to anyone who simply needed to know where they were. But in the final years before Aeloria's end, working in what the timeline suggests was full awareness that something was deeply wrong with the city she loved, Senel made her most important and most disturbing map. The map of the underground. She did not call it that in the surviving references to it. She called it in her working notes the full record, as though everything she had mapped before this had been partial, had described only the visible layer of the world, and now she was trying to do what a map had never properly done, to show the world as it actually was, including what was below the surface. How Senel gained the access she needed to make this map is a question that has no definitive answer. The underground spaces of Aeloria were not secret exactly. Their existence was generally known, but they were not publicly accessible. Access required authorization, and the deepest areas of the underground were the exclusive preserve of the keepers. For an outsider to have mapped them with the precision that the surviving fragments of Senel's map suggest would have required either keeper cooperation or extraordinary individual determination. The historical consensus, based partly on one specific passage in a letter Senel wrote to a colleague, partly on the general character of the woman as described by those who knew her, is that it was both. That she had, in the final years of the city's life, a close relationship with at least one senior keeper who believed, for reasons of their own, that the full record needed to exist, that someone needed to know. Think about what that means. A keeper, one of the people bound by oath to maintain the discretion of the underground observation, choosing in the city's last years to help a cartographer produce a complete map of the spaces they had been watching. choosing to release their knowledge early to someone who would record it. What had they seen by then that made them feel the ordinary protocols no longer mattered? What Senel's map showed, and here the surviving fragments become crucial because only portions of the original have ever been found in a state of significant deterioration, was a version of Aeloria that the city's inhabitants had never been shown. The 7 rings of the city seen from above, familiar, recognizable, but below the familiar surface, marked in Senel's precise and slightly idiosyncratic notation, a whole second layer. The natural limestone cavities, accurately charted, far more extensive than anyone who hadn't been below would have guessed. The passages connecting them, some natural, some worked by human hands. The keeper stations, marked with a specific symbol whose meaning had to be decoded from context. The water channels threading through the rock. And then, things that weren't on any other record. 3 passages from the deepest level of the keeper vaults to areas of the underground that, as far as any surviving source can determine, nobody had known existed. Not unknown in the sense of unexplored, unknown in the sense of not being on any official plan, not referenced in any keeper document that has survived, not mentioned anywhere. A chamber beneath the harbor floor, mapped with careful dimensions, oriented to the harbor above with precision. Senel had been in this chamber, she had measured it herself, the level of detail makes this certain, and she had found in it something she describes in her notes with the particular restraint of a person who is trying to be accurate about something they are not sure how to be accurate about. She writes, in what is clearly a working note rather than a finished description, the walls of the harbor chamber are not worked stone. They are the natural limestone, as throughout the deep levels. But the surface has a quality. When I hold the lamp close, the stone seems to move. Not physically, I'm certain of that, but something in the texture or in the way the light catches it, something that makes the eye uncertain, as if the rock itself is very faintly, very slowly, not quite still. Not quite still. She measured the temperature in the harbor chamber and found it significantly warmer than the other underground spaces, warmer even than the surface city, which she noted with the careful asterisk notation she used throughout her working documents to flag anomalies that she didn't yet have explanations for. She documented in the same careful notation the sound in the harbor chamber, different from the silence of the other underground spaces, not quiet, a very low, very slow sound, she struggled to describe it, that was at the edge of the range of human hearing, not quite a sound and not quite a vibration, something your body registered before your ears did. Senel marked the harbor chamber on her map with a symbol she used nowhere else. It is a simple symbol, 3 concentric circles, small, drawn in the margin of her notation rather than on the map itself, as though she was unsure whether to include it or not. No explanation, just the circles. And then, the door. The most discussed element of Senel's surviving map is a location in the deepest part of the underground, below even the harbor chamber, down in the oldest part of the limestone where the natural cavities were largest and most irregularly shaped, marked with a notation that is the only non-technical language in the entire map. Senel marks the location, she gives its dimensions, she records its temperature and the quality of the sound in the space around it. And in the margin, in her careful hand, she writes a single word in the old Aeolorian language, the word that has been translated in various ways by various scholars, as forbidden, as enough, as do not, as the limit. A door at the deepest level, beneath the oldest part of the city, marked with a single word of warning. Sail left Aeloria 3 weeks after completing this map. She left without, as far as the record shows, telling most people she was going. She packed what she could carry, arranged for certain of her other maps to be held by a colleague in the Scholars' Ring, and departed. She appears in records from at least 2 other places in the years that followed, living quietly, apparently in good health, apparently choosing never to return to the Silver Coast. She lived for many more years after leaving. She continued to work. Maps from those later years survive, technically accomplished, focused on regions far from the coast she had grown up on. She is never recorded as having explained to anyone why she left when she did. But she left the map behind. Specifically, she left it behind. It was in the colleague's care, along with the others, and it was not the kind of thing that belongs with you on a long journey unless you intend for people to find it. She left it for someone to find. She left the full record. And she marked the door with a single word and trusted that whoever read it would understand what kind of word it was.
She does not describe the keeper report directly. She says only, "What we were told, I am not able to write here. Not because it is secret, the keepers have, I think, given up on secrecy at this point, but because I am not certain my words would convey it accurately, and inaccuracy on this subject seems worse than silence." She then says, "We voted. I will tell you how I voted when I see you, if we see each other." She voted on something. They all voted on something. The vote, its nature, its outcome, is the most tantalizing lacuna in all of Aelorian scholarship, because it is clear from what follows that something was decided in that room. Something was done or not done, or chosen with enough deliberateness that it counts as a decision, something that shaped the final weeks of the city's life and possibly the manner of its end. What are the possibilities? Scholars have proposed many over the years. The most practical-minded suggest that the vote was about evacuation, whether to formally recommend or organize the departure of the city's population, or some portion of it. This is plausible. But the letter writer's tone suggests something more significant than a logistical decision. You don't say, "I'll tell you how I voted when I see you," about a logistics question. Others have suggested the vote was about the underground spaces themselves, about whether to do something, open the door that Sael had marked, or close it more firmly, or destroy the access to the deeper levels entirely. This interpretation has gained support from certain details in the Keeper preparation notes, which include a brief reference to the option of permanent sealing of something. And then there are those who follow the most unsettling thread in the evidence, the suggestion that the council voted on whether to tell the remaining population what the Keepers knew, whether to release, publicly, plainly, without the oblique professional language of institutional discretion, the knowledge of what was below the city and what it had, apparently, been doing. The Keepers have, I think, given up on secrecy at this point, the letter writer says. But she cannot write what she was told, cannot put it into words. Inaccuracy seems worse than silence. Whatever it was they knew, whatever the full record, the full Keeper observation over generations amounted to as a picture, it was the kind of thing that resists ordinary language, the kind of thing that, when you try to say it plainly, comes out wrong, either too alarming or not alarming enough, either too strange to be believed or too banal to carry the weight of what it actually means. We know one more thing about the council meeting from the tablet fragment. At some point during the meeting, a specific decision was recorded, or the record of a decision was made, which was then apparently deliberately damaged or removed from the official record later. What remains on the tablet after the crack is a partial sentence, and then a name, and then a notation that scholars have puzzled over for as long as anyone has been reading the tablet. The partial sentence reads, "Decreed by majority that the record of this decision," and then the crack, and then on the other side of the crack, barely legible, "to be destroyed before," and then the notation, a single symbol that appears exactly once elsewhere in the Aeolorian archive, in Sael's map, the 3 concentric circles she drew in the margin of her notes for the harbor chamber, unsure whether to include it. Someone in that council room had seen Sael's map, or Sael had been in that council room, or they had all looked at the same thing separately and arrived at the same symbol for it, the symbol for whatever the harbor chamber meant, whatever the not quite still walls and the warmth and the low sound at the edge of hearing, whatever all of that was part of. The council ended. The people in the room dispersed into the city's final weeks. The record that was decided to be destroyed was apparently destroyed. We have the notation on the tablet, the broken instruction, but not the decision itself. And in the days that followed, the quiet evacuation of Aeloria continued, steady, unhurried, without panic, family by family. The tools left on the benches, the lamps left filled, as if they meant to come back. They voted on something that night. The record of what they chose was destroyed before anyone else could read it, and the city was already, in all the ways that matter, emptying. Let us approach this carefully. There is a temptation when telling the story of a mysterious disappearance to reach for drama, to fill the silence with speculation dressed as narrative, to tell with confidence a story whose confidence is a kind of lie, because the truth is that nobody knows exactly what happened to Aeloria, and any account that pretends otherwise is not honest. So let us be honest, and let the honesty be its own kind of strange. What we know with reasonable confidence is this: Aeloria was a functioning city, diminished, stressed, but functioning in the period immediately before its end. The records of other settlements in the region contain references to Aeloria as a place people were coming from during what was clearly a sustained outflow of population in the city's final years. These references are matter of fact, not alarmed. People arrive from Aeloria, they settle in other places. They are ordinary people, craftspeople, traders, families, who have for various reasons left and are now building new lives elsewhere. None of these records describe a catastrophe. None say, "We received refugees from Aeloria because something terrible happened." They simply record new arrivals with a neutral administrative notation of people who are used to migration and don't consider it in itself remarkable. And then the records of arrivals from Aeloria stopped. Not dramatically, not suddenly. They simply trail off, fewer and fewer over a period of months, and then there is nothing. No more arrivals, no letters from the city, no reports of what is happening on the Silver Coast. Silence. The first people from outside Aeloria to visit the Silver Coast after the silence began were, according to a surviving account from a coastal trading settlement several days' journey north Aelorean, a small party of traders who had maintained regular commercial ties with Aeloria for years and had grown concerned at the absence of the usual contact. They arrived on the shore and found the harbor intact, the pier still standing, the city still standing. Empty. Not ruined, not burned, not flooded or collapsed, or showing the marks of any disaster or violence. The buildings were intact. The streets were clear. The canals still ran with water. The lantern, the structure at the city's center that had been kept burning continuously for centuries, was dark, its fire finally out. The city was simply empty. The traders walked through it. They left an account that has survived in fragments, a second-hand account, it should be noted, recorded by someone who spoke to the traders after their return, rather than by the traders themselves. So we are dealing with at least 2 degrees of remove from the primary experience. But the account is specific and consistent, and there is no obvious reason to doubt its basic accuracy. The traders walked through the outer rings first, the market stalls, empty but orderly, most of them still stocked with goods, covered with the cloths that sellers used to protect merchandise from weather, as though the market had closed for the night and simply never reopened. The workshops in the second ring, tools in place, materials on the benches. In one woodworking shop, a piece of furniture partway through its making, the freshly cut surfaces of the wood still pale where the older patina of the exterior had been worked away. The traders found food in some of the houses, not in every house. In many of the outer ring dwellings there was evidence of a more systematic departure, belongings clearly taken, spaces cleared. But in others, a pot on a cold hearth with something long dried in the bottom, a table laid for a meal that was never eaten. The inner rings told a similar story. The scholar's ring, books on the shelves, the writing desks set out, the observatories aimed at whatever part of the sky they had last been directed towards.
The ceremonial buildings of the sixth ring, swept and ordered, their objects arranged with care, as though prepared for a ceremony that had been planned for some future occasion. The traders did not go underground. Their account does not mention the underground spaces at all. Either they did not find the access points, or they found them and chose not to descend, or their account was recorded without including this. We don't know. They spent 2 days in the city, long enough to establish that it was genuinely empty of human life. Then they left and returned to their home settlement and told what they had found. The absence of any explanation is, in its own way, the most significant fact. There was no fire, no flood. The region's records from surrounding areas describe no unusual weather events in the relevant period. No military campaign. There were no armies in this region at this time with the capacity to have taken or destroyed a city of Aeloria's size. No plague recorded in the surrounding region. No earthquake, no volcanic event, nothing. The city was simply empty. What happened? Here is where the range of possibilities must be laid before you, gently as possibilities, not certainties, because that is all they are. The most pragmatic theory, and among historians it has the most adherents, because historians generally prefer the explanation that requires the fewest assumptions, is simply that the evacuation was complete, that what the traders found was the natural endpoint of the years-long departure that the records document, that everyone who was going to leave left, that the final residents departed in the last week.
This theory is harder to evaluate because it requires knowledge of what exactly was in the underground, which is precisely what we don't have. But it is consistent with the keeper emphasis on observation and threshold, with the specific attention Sael paid to temperature and sound in the harbor chamber, and with the detail noted by the traders who walked through the empty city, that the water in the canals, which had always run clear, was slightly colored, the shade of old copper. Slightly colored, the shade of old copper. Mineral contamination of some kind, from the underground water. Whatever was in the limestone was affecting what came out of it. A third theory, the one that generates the most scholarly discomfort, because it is the one that requires the most unusual assumptions, and therefore the least intellectually respectable to advance, is that what was in the underground was not a physical or chemical phenomenon, that the keeper records, if we had them, would not describe a geological event, that the word alive in that keeper training document was not metaphorical or approximate, but was the most accurate word available for what the keepers had, across generations, been observing. That something in the limestone beneath Aeloria had, over the centuries that the city existed above it, changed in ways that the categories available to the keepers did not fully encompass, that the door in the deepest level was a door for a reason, and that in the city's final period, something passed the threshold, not the engineered threshold that the keepers had been trained to watch for, but a larger threshold, older than the keeper institution, older than the city, older than the people who had arrived on the shore and decided this was the place where light arrives. That the depths, finally, after centuries of being witnessed, noticed back. This theory cannot be proven. It cannot even be responsibly advanced as a theory by most standards of evidence, but it is present in the scholarship, in the margin notes and the careful qualifications and the passages that seem to be reaching towards something the professional vocabulary of historical analysis doesn't quite have words for. And there is this. Among the many traders and travelers who have visited the site of the Silver Coast in the centuries since Aeloria's end, and there have been many, drawn by the reputation of the place, by the lingering power of its story, a striking number have recorded a specific experience, not a visual one, not anything that could be photographed or pointed to, a feeling, specifically the feeling of being noticed, of standing in the ruins, the walls that remain, the remnants of the pier, the outlines of the ring streets still faintly visible in the way the ground has subsided differently above the old foundations, and having the sudden bodily conviction that the place is aware of you. Not threatening, not welcoming either exactly, simply aware.
The same accounts, in almost every case, note that this feeling is followed almost immediately by an equally strong conviction that it is simply the imagination, the power of the story working on the susceptible mind, the projection of significance onto an ordinary landscape. Perhaps, almost certainly. And yet, what vanishes without a trace leaves behind only the shape of its absence. Aeloria's absence is enormous. It is 40,000 people and 3 centuries of accumulated beauty, and all of the keeper records, and Sael's complete map, and the stone tablet from the last council, and the vote that was taken and destroyed. It is the lantern, finally dark after centuries of continuous burning. It is the canals, still running with slightly copper-colored water through empty streets. It is whatever is below the empty streets, the harbor chamber, the door. The city is gone. The depths remain. And for all the centuries since, in the cool quiet below the silver coast, the limestone breathes, the water moves in its channels, the not quite still walls of the harbor chamber continue to do whatever it is they do, unseen, unobserved, in the dark that no keeper lamp has illuminated for a very long time. As you rest here, let the silence of that underground come into the room with you, not frighteningly, just as a presence, the presence of the very old and the very patient, and the things that outlast every story told about them. Aeloria is gone. What it left behind is larger than its absence, and there have been those in all the centuries since who could not leave it alone. There is a particular kind of person who is drawn to lost things. Not all lost things, not the keys misplaced on Tuesday morning, not the name you can't quite remember, not any of the ordinary daily losses that texture a life, but the larger losses, the things that went away and left no sufficient explanation, the gaps in the record where something important used to be. These people recognize Aeloria the first time they hear about it. Something in the story of the empty city, the dark lantern, the slightly copper water in the abandoned canals, something in the shape of the mystery reaches them and does not let go. They become, in the particular way that people become things without fully deciding, to seekers. There have been many across the centuries. Let us walk with some of them. The first significant post-Aelorian expedition to the Silver Coast, significant in the sense that it produced a document we still have, took place several generations after the city's end, organized by a community of scholars from a settlement some distance inland who had access to Aelorian texts through an unusual chain of transmission involving a book merchant, a fire, and a surviving library that the fire had somehow spared. Their account of the expedition is remarkable for its combination of scholarly precision and barely contained wonder, 2 qualities that don't always sit easily together, but that coexist in this text with a naturalness that suggests genuine intelligence at work. They spent 3 weeks on the site. They were methodical. They mapped what remained of the surface structures, more than you might expect given the time elapsed, because the Aelorian construction was genuinely excellent and the Silver Coast's climate is relatively gentle. They documented artifacts, ordinary domestic objects, tools, the remnants of the market goods that the traders had described as still being in place when they visited, and they went underground. Their account of the underground is the most important single document in post-Aelorian scholarship, not because it answers the central questions, it doesn't, but because it establishes what could and couldn't be accessed, and because several of its observations have proven across the subsequent centuries of scholarship to be both accurate and significant. The scholars found the keeper vaults empty. No records remained, confirming the hypothesis that whatever was in them had been removed or destroyed before the end, but the vaults themselves intact. The carved limestone chambers with their arched ceilings, the oil lamp recesses empty, the stone bench that runs along one wall of the largest chamber, worn smooth from generations of use. Someone spent a lot of time sitting on that bench. They found the natural limestone cavities, the original underground spaces that Telleth's builders had discovered, larger than they expected. The accounts of the scholars' first entry into the largest cavity describe a space that took their lamplight a long time to fully illuminate, a cavern perhaps the size of a large public hall, with a ceiling that curved out of sight in the darkness above. The water channels ran. This surprised them. After all the time, the underground water still moved through the limestone in its ancient courses, still slightly discolored. They noted it as a faint mineral quality, nothing alarming. They did not find the harbor chamber. Either they didn't know to look for it, or the access to it had been sealed, deliberately or through natural subsidence of the rock, in the centuries between the city's end and their visit. The scholars were working without Sael's map, which had not been found at this point, and their knowledge of the deeper underground was accordingly limited. They did find something else, something they were clearly not expecting, and that their account spends considerable space on, with the particular quality of writing that people produce when they have encountered something that doesn't fit their existing categories, and they are trying to be accurate about it while maintaining plausibility. In one of the natural cavities, one they reached by following a passage that the keeper vaults connected to, the scholars found marks on the wall. Not the keeper marks described in earlier documents, not the regular functional notations that the records suggest the keepers used as part of their observation system. These were different marks, larger, made with a different tool or technique, deeper into the stone, with more force, over what appeared to be a very long time, as though not one person, but many, over many years or generations, had returned to this particular wall and continued adding to what was there. The scholars copied what they could. Their copies are imperfect, they acknowledge, made quickly with the limited tools they had, and the originals were presumably in a difficult space to work in. But even the imperfect copies, preserved in the expedition account, are enough to show several things. The marks were not random. They had structure, a pattern, a system, consistent enough across the full extent of the wall to indicate intentionality rather than decoration. The marks were not in any script that the scholars could identify, not in the standard Aelorian script, not in any of the other scripts that circulated in the region. Something older, perhaps, or something specific to the keepers, or to whoever used this space before the keepers formalized their institution. A private language, a language of watching. And in the center of the wall, among all the other marks, a single image, not text, a picture drawn in the same deeply incised technique as the marks around it, but recognizable as representational. The scholars spent some time
as if different generations of visitors, with no apparent connection to each other, had looked at the same thing and then, independently, tried to record it in the same way. What was in the underground? What did they see? One of the most affecting accounts in the literature of Aeolorian exploration comes not from a scholar, but from a woman who is identified in the records only as a local. She had grown up in a small settlement near the Silver Coast and had known the ruins all her life, had played in the outer ring structures as a child, had learned to navigate the upper underground passages the way you learn to navigate the geography of any childhood landscape, familiar, ordinary, home. When she was elderly, she was visited by a scholar from a distant city who was compiling the most comprehensive account of Aeloria yet attempted. She agreed to speak to him, and the interview was recorded and has survived. She told him about the underground, and specifically about a place she had gone many times over her life that she had never told anyone about. A passage that started in one of the natural cavities and went down, quite steeply, to a level she had never seen mapped. She had followed it to its end many times as a child and as a young woman, reassuring herself, in the way of someone testing the limits of the familiar, that she knew where she was going and that it was safe. One time, when she was perhaps 40 years old, she had gone further than she ever had before. She had found a wall, not a natural wall, worked, she said, with the same fine Aeolorian technique as the buildings above, but different from anything she had seen in the upper levels. The surface of the worked stone had something on it, The same quality that Sael had described in her notes about the harbor chamber centuries before, not quite still, moving very slightly in a way that she was certain was not physical movement, but that her eyes reported as movement nonetheless, as if the stone itself were— She paused here, the scholar notes, looking for the right word, as if it were remembering something. She had stood at that wall for a long time, she said. She could not tell how long. Time had been difficult in that space. Not frightening, she was careful to say, not at all frightening, more like time in a very deep sleep, the kind of sleep where you are not conscious of passing time, but afterward you know that something has happened to you that you can't quite name. She had come back up eventually. She had never gone back. She told the scholar this and then sat for a moment in what the scholar, in his notes, describes as a silence of considerable depth. And then she said, "I think the city is still there, in some way that I don't have words for. I think the people who built it understood something about permanence that we have forgotten. I think they put something in the stone, and I think it's still holding. Still holding." She died the following winter. The scholar published his account and included the interview. It was read by other scholars and then by other seekers, and it became part of the great accumulating body of Aeolorian literature, the commentary and counter-commentary and expedition accounts and archival analyses and occasional passionate letters to colleagues that constitutes in its entirety the second city that Aeloria built after its first one was empty. A city of words this time, not of stone, built by the people who could not let go of the question. There were expeditions that found nothing and wrote honestly about finding nothing. There were expeditions that found something genuine and didn't fully understand its significance until later. There were expeditions that were poorly organized or chronically underfunded, were cut short by weather or illness or the simple exhaustion of trying to work in a landscape that is more complicated underground than it is on the surface. There was one expedition, in what the historical record suggests was the most recent significant attempt before the current era of scholarship, that reported finding an access route to what they believed from Sael's map and from comparative analysis of the topography was the harbor chamber. They found the warmth. They noted the temperature differential. They did not enter. Their leader, a careful and experienced scholar who had spent 30 years on Aeolorian research, wrote in her post-expedition report that the decision not to enter was based on engineering concerns about the stability of the passage, and that a follow-up expedition with proper support would be arranged. The follow-up expedition was arranged. It was canceled. It was arranged again, and then canceled again. Her private notes, published after her death by her children who thought them worth sharing, give a different account of why the expedition didn't enter the harbor chamber. The passage was stable. The engineering concerns were real but not prohibitive. I have been in worse places and proceeded. She pauses in the notes. There are several lines of something crossed out, too thoroughly to read. I stood at the opening of the passage for a long time, she said. I held the lamp in and looked at the wall of the chamber. Just a small portion of it. The rest was out of sight around the curve. And what I saw made me think of Sael's notation, the single word she wrote in the margin, the word that scholars translate as forbidden or do not, or the limit. I think the correct translation is simpler. I think the correct translation is enough. We know enough. We have always known enough. And going further, whatever going further would show us, I am not sure it would make us wiser, only more certain. And perhaps certainty, in this particular case, is not what we need. Some of them stopped searching not because they gave up, but because of what they found, or because of what they understood standing at the edge of the known about what finding everything would cost. We are almost at the end of our journey now. The fire is very low. The night is deep. Whatever light is in the room with you has softened to the kind of light that belongs to the late hours, the kind that makes everything look a little more itself, a little more essential, stripped of the busy detail that daylight imposes. This is a good kind of light to finish Aeloria's story in. Because the story does not end with the empty city, or the cold lantern, or the barely legible fragments of the last council's deliberations. It doesn't even end with the searchers, those many patient people who have spent portions of their lives trying to read the shape of the absence. The story ends, or rather it doesn't end, which is the point, in the living world, in the things that Aeloria, without intending to, left behind. Let us talk about those things. The most concrete legacy, the most traceable, the most directly verifiable, is in the craft traditions that descended from Aelorian practice through the people who left the city in the years of its decline and carried with them in their hands and their memories the specific skills that Aeloria had developed over its long centuries. The thin-walled pottery with its geometric borders, variations of it can be found if you know where to look in the ceramic traditions of at least 4 different regions that received significant numbers of Aelorian emigrants in the city's final decades. The patterns evolved, simplified, merged with other traditions. You wouldn't necessarily recognize the connection unless someone pointed it out, but it is there. A faint genealogical thread, the echo of a visual language that someone carried away from a silver shore and set down in a new place, and slowly, unconsciously, diluted it into something that was no longer Aelorian, but was not quite not Aelorian either. The music. This is the most interesting case and the most discussed. The Aelorian musical tradition, complex, instrument-rich, with that unusual practice of playing the stringed instrument against the chest so that the vibration is felt in the body, did not simply disappear. Scholars of musical history have identified elements of what appears to be Aelorian musical thinking in traditions that exist today, in communities that have no direct historical connection to the Silver Coast, but that share, at some structural level, a particular understanding of what music is for. Not entertainment, not performance, something closer to the practice of the headland, the act of attending, paying attention, receiving what is there to be received.
The music went underground, in a sense, became part of the invisible substrate of musical culture in the region, persisted not as a named tradition, but as a way of listening, a quality of attention that passed from musician to musician across generations without anyone necessarily knowing where it came from. Then there is the language. Aelorian did not survive as a spoken language. There are no communities today that speak it as a living tongue, but it left traces, the way dead rivers leave their courses in the landscape even after the water is gone. Certain words in several regional languages that have no obvious origin elsewhere. Certain grammatical structures that appear in communities that received Aelorian emigrants and that don't appear in communities that didn't. The word for home in at least one language of the region comes, etymologists believe, from an Aelorian root, from Aelos, the word for the place where light arrives. Carried away from the place where light arrived, planted in new soil, growing into something new that has, at its root, the memory of what it came from. But the most subtle and most interesting legacy of Aeloria is not in any of these traceable, documentable forms. It is in something that is harder to pin down, but that feels, to those who have spent time with the full weight of the Aelorian story, like the most important thing it left. It left a question. Not a specific question with a specific answer that is waiting to be found. A structural question. A question about how to be alive, how to build things, how to maintain things, how to watch over what you know while being honest about what you don't.
a question about what it means to be a civilization, whether the goal is power or beauty or permanence or something else, something harder to name. The Aelorians, at their best, attempted something unusual. They tried to build a city that was also a practice, a way of living together that was also a way of paying attention, that kept at its center not a throne or a treasury or a monument to any particular leader's greatness, but a fire, a light, the continuous, tended, deliberately maintained flame that said, "We are here, and we are watching, and the darkness has not won." They kept that fire burning without interruption for as long as the city stood. And when the city was finally empty, the fire went out. But the practice, the underlying orientation toward attention and care, and the willingness to witness what others prefer not to see, that went with the people who left, dispersed, diluted, but not entirely lost. You might ask, how do we know this? How can we know with any confidence that something as intangible as an orientation toward attention persisted and traveled and survived? We can't know it with certainty, that is the honest answer. But there is a kind of evidence that, while it doesn't meet the standards of formal historical proof, is nevertheless worth considering: the evidence of recognition. When people encounter the story of Aeloria for the first time, the founding on the Silver Shore, the patient building, the festival of tides, the keepers in their underground vaults, the cartographer and her map, the last council, the empty city, a certain number of them have an experience of recognition. Not of the specific events, which are of course unfamiliar, but of something in the structure of the thing, something in the combination of ambition and carefulness, of public beauty and private watch, of the city that was built for the unborn, and the people who sat in the dark and trusted the light was coming. Something that feels familiar, not as history, but as aspiration, as the shape of something they have been, without knowing it, reaching for. This is speculative, projection possibly, the very human tendency to see in ancient things the reflection of what you already believe. And yet, the Aelorians believed that the place where they built their city was significant not for what it contained, but for what it received, the place where light arrives. They built a civilization around the act of receiving the light, receiving the returned fire after the festival's darkness, receiving the knowledge of the depths with all its weight and strangeness. Maybe that is what they left. Not a specific legacy, but a mode, a way of being with the world that says, look at this, really look. Don't turn away from what is difficult or strange or larger than the categories you have. Don't fill the silence before you have sat with it long enough to hear what it contains. The underground of the Silver Coast is still there. The limestone cavities, the water channels, the worked keeper vaults, the images on the wall, whatever is in the harbor chamber, warm and moving still in the dark. The searchers are still searching. The scholars still argue in their careful language. The people who grew up near the ruins know the site the way you know a face, without thinking, without effort, with the particular intimacy of long familiarity. And somewhere in the accumulated body of Aelorian scholarship, in the margins of the expedition reports and the private notes and the letters from people who could not stop thinking about the place, is a sentence that appears in various forms in various sources, as though it has been independently arrived at by many different minds across many different generations. The city is still there, in some way I don't have words for. Still holding. Let that hold you for a moment as you settle into the quiet of this night. The world has always been full of things that are watching and things that are watched, full of people who maintained their posts in the cold and dark out of faithfulness to something they couldn't entirely explain, full of buildings whose foundations contain more than the builders knew, full of the long, patient underground processes that outlast every civilization raised above them, and full also of light, the light that arrives on the silver shore every morning, whether or not anyone is on the headland to receive it, the light that the Aelorians kept burning at the center of their city for as long as they were there, the light that goes on arriving, as it has always arrived, into the dark. You are here tonight in your own quiet room, in your own kind of dark. Whatever the day held, it is over now. Whatever tomorrow will ask of you, it hasn't arrived yet. There is only this moment, this warmth, this gradual softening of the mind into something looser and more receptive. The person on the headland before dawn, waiting for the light. That is where we are, you and I, in this long, dark hour between the end of one day and the beginning of the next. Receiving. Aeloria is far away now, the 7 rings and the canals and the vaults and the festival of tides, all of it is receding, the way the shore recedes when a boat moves out onto the water, becoming smaller, more luminous, more essentially itself in the distance. The cartographer made her map and left it behind. The keepers watched in the dark and kept their records, and in the end, perhaps, let someone know. The council met and voted on something none of us will ever know. And the city, the beautiful, complicated, long-remembered, permanently mysterious city of Aeloria, stood empty on its silver shore, its streets clean, its workshops in order, its canals still running, its lantern the first time dark in centuries. And in the limestone below, whatever had always been there breathed on, and the water moved in its channels, and the walls of the harbor chamber continued their long, slow, not quite still existence in the dark, as they do now, as they will. And so, as the echoes of Aeloria fade into the quiet of the night, let the last images of that silver shore settle into something soft and gentle in your mind. The headland, the sea, the small fires of morning beginning to glow in the valley below, the rings of the city rising in the early light, the canal catching the sun in pieces on the pale stone walls, the sound of someone singing at their work in the second ring, and the smell of bread, and the particular blue of the Aelorian dye in the market, and the music, always the music, threading through every corner of the city like a second kind of water. The keepers descending, patient, faithful to their watch. Sail drawing her careful lines, marking the door, placing the 3 concentric circles in the margin, setting it down and walking away into a long life in other places. The last council gathered in their low-ceilinged room, the filtered light, the vote, and then the silence, the empty streets, the canal still running, the lantern the first time dark in centuries. The vast, ancient patience of the limestone below. Let it